Hello everyone, this is Lahiru reaching out to you again to share some insights about the recent UiPath preview release 20.8 and to discuss one of the latest additions to the UiPath platform, which is the UiPath Data Service. So, what's UiPath Data Service? It's actually a platform where you can create relational data models to store the data that you process within each workflow that you are running. And also you can use the data service as a temporary data saving location for you to pass the data between multiple processes or multiple applications basically. So why is it important and what's the need of a data service? As you all know, when executing automation processes, we come across data and we extract data from various different applications and different sources such as Excel files, flat files, and so on. But where are we going to store this data as a temporary storage to pass that data to another process or maybe to hold that information until some process is executed and so on? As of now, we have been using different databases or even Excel files or different text files to store those kind of data. And most importantly, when you have or when you are processing data that are related to one another or between, if you have different relationships between the data that you process at a time, you actually need a database to store such kind of information until you get it back for the next set of process. So that's where the UiPath Data Service comes into action. It's one of the latest additions in the cloud platform as it's described, and we can use the data service to store any type of data which are relational or even the data that do not have any relationship with another entity, and you can access, read, delete, or even modify the data that's available in the data service. So it's more like a simple SQL database. And the good thing about this is that it's integrated with the entire UiPath platform so that whatever you create in the data service, it will be available in Studio and where the robot is executing. Another amazing thing about data service is that it's a drag and drop interface where you don't need to create or write any code to create the data entities. It's more like a if you if you have a background where you have worked with databases, especially with SQL, you have come across the uh, tables where we actually store the data. So it's more similar to that. What we store in data service are called as entities, and each entity will have different columns, and those will be related to different other entities as well. So it's simply thinking about it, it's a representation of a simple database that can have relational models. And the other good thing is that it's supporting open APIs so that we can integrate any application that we have to data service without much of a hassle. So how do you actually use it? So let me get to the actual application. So first thing is once you log into the cloud platform, you will see a new option called data service here. But by default, this will not be enabled for you. So what you need to do is you need to go to admin and under your tenant. So I have already enabled that, but I'm going to show you how to enable it. Under tenant, you just go to this option and click on edit service and click on this data service and edit license and click on save. Once you have done that, within a couple of seconds it will prepare your data service environment and you will see the data service option here. So you can navigate to data service either by this option or you can click on the data service on the left panel. So once you get into data service, this is the screen that you will get. So all the entities we create over here will be listed in this screen. So before creating any entities, I would like to show some additional stuff. Like if you click on these three dots next to create new entity, there's an option for user management. In this, you will have all the available users in your environment, and each user will have particular roles, as you can see here. So you can either add a user or user group, and you can assign the required roles for each user. And if you get to roles, we have these kind of roles over here: admin, data reader, data writer, and a designer. And you can view the permission levels by clicking on this I option. So as you see, for the admin, we don't have any permissions granted at the moment. But if you check the data reader can read a schema, and he can also read the data in that schema. Likewise, if you check the writer have different access levels. So he can read the data, read the schema, and he can read, create, edit, and delete the data in that schema. Likewise, if you check the designer will have no access to the data, but he will have all the access needed to design or create, edit, delete the data schemas basically. So depending on your requirement, you can assign the different users and user roles for the user. So getting back to the entity screen, how do you create a new entity? So this actually depends on the requirement. Based on the data that you need to store in the data service, you need to create the entities. So I have a simple requirement here. I actually get this kind of data. So assume that I'm getting this information from a different system and from some Excel files, basically. So just to simulate that, I have an Excel file over here. So in the first sheet, I have the student ID, first name, last name, and the age. And in the second sheet, I have some activities that each and every student is performing, and this and the activity name, registered date, and the cost per month for that particular activity for each and every student. So don't worry about the data now, just worry about the columns that we are focusing on, because at this level we are going to create the entities. So all you need to know is what type of data is going to be stored in each and every column. So if it's registered date, you can see that it's a date. If it's cost, it could be a number, and so on. And you can see how these two are related. It's related by the student ID. So we can include a relationship between these two. So let's create some entities for these two. So once you get here, I can create a new entity by clicking on this option or by clicking on the option on the top right. So first thing you need to do is you need to give a name for the entity. So for the first one, I will say student entity, and you can also provide a description. Uh, student information, and click on save. So now you have the first entity created, and you can see the name, the description, and you can also see that by default it has 5 fields and 0 rows. So what are these 5 fields, and how we can see that is by clicking on this display name. So once you get into the student entity, you can see that few fields are created automatically, and the ID is a unique identifier for each and every row. which is of type unique ID. Basically, it's a GUID if you are familiar with database terms. And these things will basically have the created time, created by, and those basic information. So what are the fields that we need to add? Getting back to the Excel, I need to add student ID, first name, last name, and the age. So let's do that now. So I'll be clicking on the create new field option here, and I'll be adding student ID of type text. So we have different types as we see here. So if we take, uh, select text, you can also say whether it's a required field or not. And if you go into more details, you can see the maximum length, and if you have a default value, for example, if you are not assigning any value to that, what's the default value that needs to go in. And if you need to have a field description, that can also be included here. So I'm going to keep this as it is and click on save, and you can see that that field is available here. So likewise, let's create the other fields. Now I'm creating the student first name, and that's also going to be text, and it's a required field. I won't be changing anything over here. And the other one, last name, again text, it's required, and the age. So age I will mark it as text as of now because we are not going to do any calculations, and it's again required. So we have completed the first entity. Now going back to the second entity, here we have different data types and along with the relationship. So let's see how we can create that. So I'll be, before getting into that, if you move into data tab, you will be able to see any available data over here. So I'll get back to that later. So getting back to entities, I'll be needing to create another entity. I will say student activities. And say, so again we have that same default fields just like we had in the previous entity, and we just need to create the fields we need. And I'll be creating the student ID, activity name, registration date, and cost. So the first field I will be saying student ID, and this time it's not going to be a text, but it's going to be a relationship because I need to relate the student ID with the student entity to get the student information. So it will be a relationship, and what's the related entity? It's student. And in the student entity, what's the field that we are going to map the student ID of the new entity we are creating? It's in this drop down, you can select student ID. So because I have the same name in both entities, it will be showing as it is. And this is also a required field. And if you go into more details, you will have a description to enter. So it's not mandatory, and let's click on save. Likewise, you can create the other fields, activity name, and it's going to be a text as earlier. Now the next one is the date because I have the registration date. So I'll be creating a new field, date of type date time. So here we have another option whether it's asking whether we need to hide the time field of the date. So if we take the date portion, we have the date and the time. So if we don't need to store the time, we can hide that part. So I will not be needing the time for now, so I'll be saying to hide the time field, and it's required. And also, if you have a default value, if this field comes in as empty, what's the default date that you are going to include, you can select the date from the date time picker that we have here. So as of now, I don't need any date, so I'll be ignoring that and clicking on save. And the last one is the cost per month. So over here, cost per month, and this time it's going to be a number. So you must be wondering what's yes and no. It's a boolean variable where you need to say whether it's true or false, for example. And in the default value also we have that option. So for the cost, it's not a boolean, so I need a number. And again, it's required. And under more details, you can see that it's asking for the maximum value and the minimum value. And if you have any decimal places, how many decimal places? So in my scenario, the cost is always greater than 0. So I can have the maximum value as it is. But as a validation, I would say my minimum value is 0. And I would sometimes need 2 decimal places. So I'll leave it as it is. And if you have any default value, again, you can specify that and the description and click on save. So that's how you actually create your entities based on your requirement. You can have any number of entities relating to each other through this relationship option, and how we are going to insert or update the data in these entities is going to be through your UiPath Studio workflows that you design. So that's a separate tutorial that's coming in quite soon. So as of now, this is how you create the entities, and if you go into data field, you will be able to see if there is any available data. And also you can create a simple data row. So I'll create a simple one in student, go into data, and you can click on add new data, or you can click on add data. So here we can see all the fields available for that particular entity. So I will say student ID is something like that, and the first name is Lahiru, and age I would say 30. And if you click save, that information will be stored in the entity and it will show under the data tag. So you can see the ID, which is a GUI ID, and the values that we entered, and by default we have the created time, created by, and the other information. And if you get into the student activities, and if you go into data and click on add data, here under student ID, now remember this student ID is a relationship type, so it has to have the data available in the student entity, in the student field. So what's the available values over there? And you can see if I click on this drop down, it will be showing the available values. So as of now we only have one, so it's showing the ID or the column that I have marked as the relationship, which has the ST001, and it's showing the GUI ID. So, or else I can also search for a specific ID like this, or else you can select from the available options. And you can also view the entity data over here, so that it will move to the student entity in a new tab and it will show the available data. And you have the search option there as well. So I will be selecting this one, and the activity name I will say, and the registration date this. So by default it shows the today's date, and I will say the cost is click on save. So now you can see that it has the relationship field where it's getting the data from the student entity, and you have the other information that we provided. So basically that's how you manually enter data, and that's how the relationships are built. So when it comes to automations, you are not going to manually add the data over here. You will be adding that through UiPath workflows in Studio. So I'll be going through that part in another video. So I'll see you there. Until then, happy automation.